We begin the day with the new U.S. push for dominance in Latin America and what it could mean for the region and the rest of the world. Venezuela's far-left leader, Nicolás Maduro, appeared in a New York court on Monday, 2 days after he was seized in Caracas by elite U.S. military forces. A defiant Maduro told the judge that he had been kidnapped, adding that he is still president of Venezuela. Now, it's important to note here that Maduro's claim to the presidency was widely contested long before his capture. The events in Caracas, they've demonstrated that President Trump is willing to use U.S. military force to oust a foreign leader on foreign soil. And Trump has suggested it could be just the first step in asserting U.S. dominance in the Western Hemisphere. But this military muscle flexing, it is also facing criticism from U.S. adversaries and allies alike. Here's what the UN's Human Rights Office had to say.
Narrative is emerging that seeks to justify the U.S. military intervention as a response to the Maduro government's appalling human rights record. But far from being a victory for human rights, this military intervention, which is in contravention of Venezuelan sovereignty and the UN Charter, damages the architecture of international security, making every country less safe. And no amount of deception or distraction can alter these facts.
Well, to look at the wider implications of this, I'm joined now by political scientist Oliver Stuenkel. He's a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and a fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School in Washington, D.C. Mr. Stuenkel, it's good to have you with us. You know, when you look at the events of the past few days, it feels like we've been here before. We've seen many U.S. operations in the past to bring about regime change in different countries in Latin America. So what is different about this one in Venezuela?
Hello. Well, first of all, this is not the first time, of course, the United States is seeking to interfere in the domestic political dynamics of Latin American countries. However, it is the first time that the United States is using overtly military force to topple a South American head of state. That has actually never happened before. So in the past, the United States has worked through covert action, for example, or has financed or provided weapons to opposition forces, but never in such an overt way. There have been similar cases in the Caribbean and Central America, but for the first time in South America. So this is for a region that long views itself as the most Pacific, or one of the most Pacific, with the lowest geopolitical risk, certainly a watershed moment.
The U.S. president, he has invoked the Donroe Doctrine as part of his justification for capturing Maduro. For our viewers, can you tell us, what is the Donroe Doctrine?
The Donroe Doctrine from 1823 under the Monroe presidency was initially a doctrine to keep the Europeans out of the Americas, of the Western Hemisphere, because these were fairly vulnerable nations, recently independent at the time. And this was basically a way to protect them from European imperialism. However, in the early 20th century, particularly through the Roosevelt corollary, the Donroe Doctrine then was utilized above all as justification for the United States to intervene in Latin American affairs, and this led to a long list of military interventions in the region throughout the 20th century. So it was no longer seen during the past century by Latin America as a protective measure, but largely as a codification, as a formalization of just classic sphere of influence thinking, the fact that the United States views Latin America as its backyard.
And now you have President Trump calling his version of the Donroe Doctrine the Donroe Doctrine. I mean, how would you sum up his version? I mean, what's the policy vision behind it?
Well, there's a lot of debates across Latin America and even here in Washington of what exactly the rationale is. And what is striking is that the justifications coming out of the White House for this military action in Venezuela have shifted quite substantively over the past months. Initially, it was about drugs. A lot of people pointed out that while there is, of course, drug trafficking going on in Venezuela, possibly with participation from the Venezuelan government, it's not a major player. There's no large amount of cocaine being produced in Venezuela. It's a transit country. There's no fentanyl coming out of Venezuela. Then at some other points, Trump officials said it's about promoting democracy. But the United States obviously has very cordial relationships with other authoritarian leaders, including in the hemisphere, such as in El Salvador. And some people suspect that it may be to remove an ally of Russia and China. So I think there's several justifications going on here. The fact that there's no single coherent justification produces a lot of apprehension among other leaders in the region, because it's unclear whether the United States will stop or actually consider removing other presidents such as Colombia's Gustavo Petro.
Yeah, let me ask you about him. Should Colombian President Gustavo Petro, should he be worried tonight after seeing what happened in Caracas?
Well, this points to a very interesting dynamic, of course, because the collapse of Venezuela has been really bad news for many South American countries over the past decade. You have a proliferation of organized crime in Venezuela, particularly in the border regions. It's a country that hasn't collaborated, for example, in the fight against deforestation in the Amazon. It's also an economic basket case, so you've had lots of migratory pressures in the region. So countries, in principle, would benefit tremendously from a stabilized Venezuela. The problem now is that if Venezuela stabilizes now, this could embolden Trump to actually do the same thing in other countries. So you have a perverse incentive now for countries in Latin America to actually prevent this to become a positive case, because that could then lead Trump to be emboldened and tried elsewhere. I think a lot of military officials in the region are concerned. I think probably the decision to topple Petro is not imminent. He will not run in the election a few months from now. I think the country most affected in the short term will probably be Cuba, which is highly dependent on Venezuelan oil. But now that the United States plays a pivotal role in managing Venezuelan oil, certainly that support will cease. So you most likely will have a destabilization there with potential U.S. involvement as well.
And if we look beyond Latin America, President Trump has made no secret about wanting to annex Greenland, which is now part of Denmark, although it is self-governing. I want us to take a listen to what the U.S. president has said, his latest remarks about Greenland.
We need Greenland from a national security situation. It's so strategic. Right now, Greenland is covered with Russian and Chinese ships all over the place. We need Greenland from the standpoint of national security. And Denmark is not going to be able to do it, I can tell you.
So, Mr. Stuenkel, you know, since that comment was made on Air Force One, European leaders, they have been quick to jump to Denmark's defense. But if President Trump, if he actually decided to take control of Greenland, what could these European leaders, what could they do to stop him?
Not much, actually. So the United States, or the Trump administration specifically, views Greenland as part of the Western Hemisphere and is aggressively questioning whether Denmark is able to control it. The affirmation about the Russian and Chinese influence is actually not correct. There is a military base from the United States in Greenland, and Denmark has basically told Washington that it's very open to cooperate with the United States on the exploitation of natural resources. So I think it's really mostly about the legacy. I think Trump would like to be known as the president who annexed Greenland. And I think Europe, given its defense dependency still on the United States, and the fact that if NATO, for example, were to cease to exist, I think this would be much more concerning to the Europeans than to the Trump administration. So while there would probably be outrage and lots of notes of protest and diplomatic crisis, Europe at this stage still depends for its national security on the United States. So there's really not that much Europe can do. Will certainly accelerate debates in Europe about the need to become more strategically autonomous.
Is that why we have seen European countries so reluctant to really come down hard on the Trump administration? I mean, we did get a letter that was sent out saying basically that the Greenlanders, they should decide their own future, but they didn't directly criticize what Trump has said or what he did in Venezuela. Is it because, as you're implying, that they know they really can't do anything?
Well, yes, and I think a lot of countries are reluctant to criticize Trump. From a Latin American standpoint, it has been quite disappointing, actually, that several European governments have been fairly vague in saying, well, it's a complicated issue, whereas when you look at international law, it's fairly clear that toppling a foreign leader is a violation of the UN Charter. It's a violation of Venezuelan democracy. And this is irrespective of the fact that Maduro has been a terrible leader, of course, who has systematically violated human rights at home, who's probably stolen an election. It still doesn't justify a foreign military action against a sitting leader. So, but Europe is, of course, quite concerned, I think, above all, with the Greenland situation. And from what I'm hearing in Washington, this is increasingly seen as a fairly realistic scenario, particularly because given that Europe is unlikely to militarily resist, the United States essentially could occupy Greenland without expecting any significant cost or lives lost of American soldiers.
And, you know, the rest of the world is watching this and wondering. I'm thinking here of Russia and China. Could they use this president to serve their own interests?
Well, certainly whether or what Russia does in Ukraine or in the Baltics or what China does vis-a-vis Taiwan depends on many factors. But the fact is that these flagrant violations, be it actually in action in implemented in Venezuela or even in rhetoric in Greenland, normalizes a new logic in international affairs. Actually, not a new logic. It's a very old logic that we've seen in the 19th century and before that, where might makes right, where international rules are violated frequently in the name of national interest. And I think the past 80 years have been very unusual in international history because we've had a multilateral system where, of course, wars did occur, rules have been violated, but still exceptionally peaceful in part because there was a broad acceptance of the necessity to accept rules like respecting the sovereignty of other countries. So the normalization of that could certainly contribute to the fact that other major powers also violate these rules, because then, of course, the United States is much less well-equipped to criticize these violations, be it by Russia or China.
I want to come back before we run out of time to this notion of a renewal of American hegemony in the Western Hemisphere. Could the removal of Nicolás Maduro succeed in weakening China and Russia's influence in Latin America?
Well, of course, Russia and China were quite influential in Venezuela. But if you look at the structural factors, it's largely of China's presence in Latin America. It's largely about economic complementarity. I mean, Brazil exports more to China than it does to Europe and the United States combined. And that's not because Brazil likes China. It's just because there's incredible demand for for Brazilian commodities coming from China. So I think it's very difficult to actually change that. Of course, Maduro was an ally, but Delcy Rodriguez, who's now the acting president of Venezuela, is also fairly close, or has been close, to Russia. So I think we'll have to also see where Venezuela will stand. I would actually say that U.S. action in Venezuela may end up strengthening China in Latin America, because other countries will seek to diversify their ties further and reduce their vulnerability to the United States. It may actually end up being good news for China, because other Latin American countries will seek to move closer to Beijing in order to increase their strategic autonomy.
Yeah. Political scientist Oliver Stuenkel. Mr. Stuenkel, we've covered a lot of territory here. We appreciate your time and your valuable insights tonight. Thank you.
Thank you very much.